Welcome to Real Paranormal Activity, the network. Entertainment you'll enjoy.
You are listening to an RPA production, where people gather. LaFosse Corporation, LLC.
The world is full of mysteries. It's full of strangeness. And it exists with oddities. That's what we do on this show. We examine the strangeness, the mysterious, the oddities. This is Terry's Mysterious Moments, and I am your presenter, Terry from Texas. This is Season 8. Welcome if it's your first time. Welcome back if you've been here before. Go with us on this trip while we look at cryptids like Bigfoot, the Yeti, the Loch Ness Monster, and maybe even Thunderbirds. Be with us while we examine stories of legends such as werewolves, vampires, witches, ghosts, and hauntings. Thank you for being here. Enjoy the show. Greetings to all of my Mysterians. Have you ever taken a walk in a graveyard at night on purpose? That's one of the classic tropes, if you will, of being in the paranormal field, going out on ghost hunts in the cemeteries. A lot of things have been found in cemeteries. They have sighted figures. They have sighted shadow people. They have sighted strange lights, odd noises in the cemetery late at night. But is it the daily residents of the cemetery that are making all of these things happen? Or is it a lot of imagination? I have said before that I don't need to go out on ghost hunts because the ghosts tend to find me. And that's been true most of my life. So I don't feel the need to go to a cemetery in the middle of the night to, one, violate the rules, and number two, I'm too old and infirm to run fast if I have to. So I'd get caught. But when I was in college, if we wanted to walk to the local TGNY store, we would have to walk through a fairly large cemetery. And it was fine at 4 o'clock in the afternoon before the time change. But if you went any later and had to walk back through the cemetery at dark, it got a little hairy. Number one, because you normally didn't bring a flashlight. And that's always a bad thing, not to have a flashlight when you're in terra incognita, as most cemeteries are, because they're not someplace you go regularly. I mean, unless you just know a bunch of sick people. I hate to say it that way, but I have seen things at my hometown cemetery that were weird to begin with. But then, as cooler heads prevailed and explanations were made, they made sense. We could drive by the cemetery and see lights flashing all throughout the cemetery. And then we realized that the shiny granite of most of the headstones were reflecting the reflector lights of our cars as we went by. I used to ride my motorcycle around a small graveyard down from where our gas station used to be. And people got after me, but it was the living, not the dead. The cemetery that my brother is buried in outside of Rockdale is fairly small, but it's kind of back in the woods, and it's one of those really kind of strange places. You just feel things there. My other brother is buried in the cemetery behind the church he went to. And his funeral was the only time I went there to that cemetery, so I can't say much about it. The cemetery that my parents, my father and biological mother, and my grandparents, my brother, second brother, are buried in. It's a very large cemetery, but it doesn't give you any weird feelings. Of course, I've only been in there during the day, but I wouldn't go in there at night just because. They're dangerous places to walk around if you don't know what's there. And I mean physically. I'm not saying there are booger bears in there, or boogeymen, or boogie women for that matter. But cemeteries just have an air of mystery, of eeriness. But did you know that back in the day, long time ago, cemeteries were built in such a way as to entice people to come out and have a day in the cemetery, have picnics there? They weren't places of sadness necessarily. They were much like public parks, and the city intended for them to be used like public parks. So, is it just long-term history that makes cemeteries frightening places? Yeah, it could be. If people were into grave robbing and got into a couple of graves, the people that would come out the next day would find the graves open and very possibly think that there was a vampire in the area, or there were vampires, or zombies, or whatever they thought the otherworldly creatures might be. There's a lot of stories, even in the United States, of things happening in cemeteries and people being blamed for being vampires. I forgot exactly what state it's in, but it's up in the Northeast, and the family name was Brown, I believe it was, and one of the girls died of, one can assume, was tuberculosis, and then her brother died of it, and then it just kind of spread around. Well, somebody said, well, obviously there's a vampire. So they dug up the girl who was the first one to die, and her body was not corrupted yet. So they did the ritual to rid themselves of a vampire. And they did that when the brother was still sick. And what they did was they cut out the heart, burned it, and then mixed the ashes of the burned heart in with something. And the brother was meant to drink it. Well, it didn't help. He died. So there was not really a for sure thing that the sister was a vampire, or that the brother died of vampirism. There are many stories told of graveyards where certain statues would move, watch you as you walked by. The head would move. They would sometimes reach out for people. I know that back home, there's a cemetery outside of the town of Rockdale where a Confederate colonel was buried. At least I think he was a Confederate. Anyway, he was a Civil War colonel, was buried. And they put up a full-size statue of him over the grave. And there were rumors and stories, and I don't know how much alcohol had to do with this, or even drug use for that matter, that you could walk in and go up to the statue and the eyes would follow you as you walked around the statue. There were reports that the statue raised its sword at people. And those stories went on for a little while, apparently not for a very long time, but long enough to get people's attention. And then some fools tore it down, broke the statue. I don't know if they've ever rebuilt it and put it back up. But it's sad that people would react that way to something that was not theirs, and they just tear it up. There are stories of gates to hell being found in cemeteries. They find a set of stairs leading downward into the cemetery grounds, which is something I talked about a few episodes ago. Excuse me. And there were things that were put in graveyards to. There was a fear of people after Edgar Allan Poe came out with, I think it was The Telltale Heart, and the Oblong Box possibly, where people were afraid of being buried alive. So they would sell these apparatuses to where there would be a bell connected to the grave with a line running down into the coffin. And if you heard the bell ringing, you had what was called a dead ringer, and you go out, you could dig up the person and find out if they were still alive. Because there were lots of episodes where people would go into a death-like state and actually be considered dead and be buried. And for some reason, they'd go out and dig them up a little while later, and they'd find out that the body had contorted in such a way as to give them the idea that they had been trying to tear out of the grave. So that's a scary thought. One of my favorite stories was that there was a young girl who was in fine health, and then all of a sudden one day she just up and appeared to die. So the family grieved, had her prepared for burial, but this is before a lot of people could afford being embalmed. And so they buried the girl out in the town cemetery, and every night her dog would go to the grave and lay on the grave and howl and cry. And finally, after several days, they got a little fed up with it, and they went out to settle the dog down. They dug up the girl and found out that she had been buried alive, and she had been trying to claw her way out of the coffin. That was one of those old stories that they used to be told around campfires and scare people. There are several places in the United States, such as Bachelor's Grove Cemetery outside of Chicago, I believe it is, where there have been specters seen in the cemetery. This one being a lady sitting on a gravestone like she was crying. Another famous cemetery around Chicago is Resurrection Cemetery. I don't know if I've got that right. It's on the south side of Chicago. And that's where the story of Resurrection Mary comes from, where men driving by would pick up this girl and give her a ride either to a dance or back toward the cemetery, and she'd get out of the car at the cemetery, and they had lent her their coat because she was cold. Well, then they would come back the next day to find out if there was a house around there, and they went to the house where the girl got out of the car, and the lady said, yeah, that was my daughter, but she died like 10 years ago, or whatever it was. She's buried over there in the cemetery. And they'd go over and look, and the coat would be folded up on the gravestone of this girl. There's a lot of stories about her, Resurrection Mary. Do I believe it? I think there's some truth to the story. There's always some truth to some stories. There's a story of a gravestone up in this northeastern place that is the foot and lower leg of supposedly a witch, I believe it is. Looks like it's been burned into the gravestone of this rich man that had died and was buried there because of some problems that they had as livings. There's the one gravestone in I think it's in Salt Lake City, where it says the lady was the victim of the beast 666. And there's no real explanation as to what happened to this woman. And, who knows? Would it maybe even not be a real gravestone, just something somebody placed? One of my favorite graveyards to go to would be, if I could, the one in Tombstone, because I'd like to take a picture of that one gravestone or grave board that says, "Here lies the body of Lester Moore, 4 slugs from a 44, no less, no more." Why do people think of things like that? Who knows? Very, very weird humor, which I'm akin to. I can understand it. The gravestone that I like is supposedly the one of a person that was always afraid of getting sick, and they died and were buried, and on the stone was written, "See, I told you I was sick." I love watching this show called Hollywood Graveyard. It's on YouTube. And they go to different areas looking for famous gravestones. A lot of people you know, a lot of people you don't know. Some of them even go overseas to Europe and find gravestones of famous people. Some of them are even in the the Far East. And it's interesting because it kind of gives you an insight on times past. So, would I go into a graveyard in the middle of the night? Probably not. Would I go looking for ghosts in a graveyard? No. I have a friend who has apparently seen a couple of strange things in the graveyard her parents are buried in. A little small Central Texas town. And I've told that story before. She's told one story of this man that was kind of lingering around the cemetery, and then came up to her, or came toward her, and she got in the car and beat feet, left the cemetery quickly. I would have too. I would have bailed out and boogied out and got away from there. The fun thing about finding out that there are old cemeteries probably shouldn't be, or where there shouldn't be houses. There's a housing area outside of Houston, outside of Crosby actually, where there was an old black cemetery. It was called the Black Hope area, thus the Black Hope Cemetery. And when the developers bought the property and were looking to build houses out there, they supposedly moved all the bodies out of the graveyard and relocated them. Well, it's easier to take a stone and put it somewhere else than it is to dig up a body and take it somewhere else. And apparently that's what happened. And there was a TV movie made about it called the Grave Secrets, the Black Hope, The Legend of Hilltop Drive. But it was about the Black Hope horror outside of Crosby. And it was a very interesting movie. Consider some of the story of Poltergeist, where the houses were built on graveyards and the bodies weren't exhumed and taken away. And I think that's where some of the storyline came from, but I'm not sure. That's always a fear of people to find out that their housing area is built on a graveyard. Well, that's why I've got all kinds of ghosts in my house. Well, you might have ghosts, you might not have ghosts, But graveyards are to be places of peace. And I don't think it would be worth the chance of running into something that you don't want to run into by going out there when you're not supposed to be there. I think that the dead ought to rest in peace, that we ought to be respectful of that concept, that we ought to just not go out there just to get our kicks, because you could get kicked. You may not want to meet in the dark. Again, I believe in ghosts. I believe that they do inhabit the earth in their form. But I'm not going to go looking for them. If you say that cemetery over there is haunted, I'll believe you. One I know of that I'm not going to go stand around at night is the one across the street from this church that I've been to several times. And in the back of the cemetery, away from the church, are graves of babies, graves of children. And if you sit at the church at night, you can hear babies crying. And that would wig me out to no end. So I stay away from things like that. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it. I don't really want to go to a graveyard until I got to. I hope you enjoyed the story, and I hope you'll be back next time with more Terry's Mysterious Moments. Have a good week, y'all. Be careful, be safe, and we'll see you again. Bye.